Hello everybody, my name is Archit Dongre. The purpose of this session today is to deep dive into the GS1 paper. So in my opinion, GS1 I feel is one of the most syllabus dense paper. It has multiple dimensions to it, and I feel like the amount of interlinkages between the GS1 micro themes themselves and also with the other GS papers is the highest in the GS1 paper. This is primarily because of the fact that geography that appears in the GS1 syllabus is one of the most widely asked topics of the UPSC. And when we go into geography, what happens is that there are multiple overlapping themes. For example, your soil, your cropping pattern with GS3, your economic geography with your economic syllabus, infrastructure, etc. Science and tech also has an element of geography, in the sense that space technology also will ask you about the geostationary orbits or the satellite systems that we are launching, etc. So I feel a lot of overlap has contributed to GS1 becoming one of the most syllabus dense papers, right? So in general, we have already seen that this in the past, and we'll just talk about it briefly. Let's look at the nature of the GS papers, right? So GS1 having 255 questions across the years, which is the highest across any GS paper, right? GS2 coming in close at 245, GS3 at 248, and GS4, which is ethics, is at 153 questions because of the case studies that are being asked and 10 markers being fewer, right? So it just goes on to show that we must prepare very well for our GS1 papers. I mean, across the past few years, marks have been quite low for many people who are giving the mains exam, and I feel like if you can capitalize on this paper well, then you can create a sort of margin between you and the other people, which can give you an edge in the paper, right? So 100 plus marks should be definitely targeted in GS1 paper. Also because of the fact that a lot of optionals also overlap with GS1. For example, geography, so history optional. So some people might definitely have an advantage. So I would say that use that to your advantage and kind of try to ace this paper, right? So this is the broad overview of the questions that have been asked in the GS papers over the years. Let's look at the broad themes focusing on the GS1, right? So if you look at this chart, this has micro themes across, or subjects as we know them, across all the 4 GS papers. Now look at the amount of themes that fall in the GS1 paper, which is just one paper out of all the GS papers, right? So it's art and culture at 30 questions, modern history 32 questions, world history 16 questions, society 76 questions, geography 91 questions, post independence just 10 questions. Your social justice can sometimes be overlapped with your society part, so we can just add that here as well, right? Disaster, environment, SNT, so chalo, it's different papers. Just look at the broad coverage of your GS1 paper across the major subjects, right? If this is a scale and this part is taken by GS1, then almost equivalent amount of parts is just shared by 2 other papers, right? So you have to divide this by half. So just look at what I'm trying to show you is the disproportionate coverage of the GS1 papers. So I'm telling you this because some people have told me also, and I felt this myself, that we sometimes get kind of boggled down by the GS1 paper, ki it's taking too much time to prepare this paper. If I'm spending so much time on GS1, how will I cover other papers, etc., so on and so forth. So let's put an end to that anxiety, right? It is a big paper, it will take some time. I would suggest you that you plan your 70 odd days that you have to prepare well for this paper, and so that you know that you don't plan fewer days for this paper and end up feeling anxious before the exam that I have not been able to give enough time, or I've not been able to revise effectively, right? So another advantage that I feel like GS1 can provide you with is that a lot of these things you have studied very well in your prelims. The problem with the GS2 and GS3 papers is that like your internal security, disaster management, all these things don't really fall into the prelims syllabus. So you tend to kind of skip them at that time of that point of time, and then when you come to that part of the syllabus is when you are preparing for your mains just between the 70 days. So you're kind of to rush. With this part of the syllabus, I feel like a lot of part is already very well covered in the prelims preparation, and you must have gone over it multiple times because you prepare for prelims very extensively for those Jan to May, whatever time that you spent, right? Out of this part, only two subjects, or I feel, are kind of skipped in the mains preparation, which is your world history and your post-independence. But then just look at the amount of questions being asked all across the years is 10 and 16, right? So don't worry that you have to cover a lot of syllabus. You are also, if the syllabus is too big, you are also have prepared quite well for this in the prelims paper, right? So all you have to do is cover the world history and post-independence from the shortest sources that you can find, because I feel like the return on investment factor is a very important thing to be kept in mind when you are preparing for the mains exam, right? Because paucity of time is high, and you have to kind of focus on what you want to do well. Because I think if you prepare much better for the geography paper at 91 questions, you can sort of expect higher returns than comparing to study your world history or post independence, which has fewer questions, but you should still kind of prepare that, right? So we have established the fact that GS1 is a very important paper, very syllabus dense, very broad coverage is there. So what we'll do is, like the other papers, we'll sort of go into a deep dive and look at the different subjects that we can break the GS1 paper down into, okay? And then what we can do is we can look at the way that we should sort of prepare this in the short time that we have, and then we'll look at how to deliver content, which is your answer writing and answer structuring, when you are asked a question on your GS1 topics, right? So let us start with the major part, which is your modern history, right? At 32 questions, it's quite important. So now that we know that we have to study modern history, how do we sort of get into the preparation part, right? Like always, I feel like it's always a better bet to study a particular subject by breaking down the micro themes in it, so that you know what you have to study, rather than picking up a textbook and then going through the pages endlessly in some kind of a logical progression. I feel like that's not a very good way to do preparation for the mains paper when you have lesser time, and you can sort of look at what areas are much more important. So it makes more sense to study the areas that are more important better than those that are not asked quite as frequently. Because mains paper is somehow about delivering content and concise points, and not much about how wide your reading is, right? So that is good strategy when you are in the month of June, July, and starting your preparation to study a book properly. But then I feel like when you're in the mains paper, this is a better way to approach. So now I have want to prepare for the GS1 paper. I know the first subject is my modern history. I first pick out all the relevant themes. Now, just because I have the data in front of me, what I know right now is the highest amount of questions are being asked from certain specific areas. For example, important contributors or contributions by people in the freedom struggle. That is very highly asked. Equally highly asked is your various stages of freedom struggle. Now we'll see a lot of PYQs on this also, which will sort of hint to this part of the syllabus. Gandhiji and Indian leaders in the freedom movement and their contributions specifically. Your part about 1857 revolt and the other wars. Certain personalities are being asked, Governor General's example, right? So, for example, there was a question in the PYQs asking us to compare Jawaharlal Nehru with Lord Curzon, right? They might very well ask you contributions of Lord Dalhousie, right? And different parts like Hardinge and his contributions or whatever he did, right? Wavell. So we must know a thing or two about these people. We must know what was their role in the freedom struggle, how they opposed the Congress initiatives, or what were their policies. If there were some positive contributions, for example, like with Dalhousie, building the tram or the railways and the telegraph and the PWD reforms, whatever that was, you know that. we must know that as well. Alternatively, they can link these things. For example, governor general part can be linked with the various stages of the freedom struggle part. So an overall contribution of these personalities in the freedom struggle are freedom fighters from our country as well, their contribution to that. So this is a very broad theme that is being repeatedly asked, right? So social reform movements are also very important part. Like for example, after your the new Renaissance movement that was called, Raja Ram Mohan Roy was involved in that. What was those contributions? What are the changes? So Deshi movement also had a very nice dimension to it, where a lot of scientific progress and cultural changes also took place, right? It was not just a freedom struggle in a very categorical sense, but a lot of different things came about. New enterprises started. We tried our hand at domestic manufacturing of certain goods as well, right? A lot of literature was coming up at that point of time. So something on these dimensions also must be prepared, right? Other than that, British economic policies, colonial rule impact, general questions, general ideas, you must know that well. Movements, tribals and peasants, soldiers, women, right? Different movements and different geographical parts of the country. Socialist movements post 1930s, revolutionary movements, what were those certain instances, etc., etc. So now that you know the basic areas that are repeatedly asked and the repeated dimensions, now I would suggest take one thing at a point of time and just study it well. So for example, if I set to start modern history today, I will pick up the movements and I will go for the tribals first, then the peasants. So with this, I will be covering all the relevant dimensions and all the multi-stakeholders and the actors who were part of that movement at that point of time, right? That will sort of give me as this coverage that if a question is asked on the role of tribals in some certain movement, for example, the civil disobedience movement, I will have had that prepared well with 5 to 6 points on their successes, their failures, what helped them, what didn't help them, and the overall idea behind that particular movement, right? So that is how I would sort of go about this preparation with the help of micro themes, so that my work is done much easier, right? So let's take an example of a micro theme. Now, suppose I set to study with these micro themes. Let's say I want to pick out a certain micro theme. So I choose stages of the freedom struggle, right? You can see that it's asked very highly. So let's pick up certain things that are very important, right? Now, once I pick up a micro theme, I know what area to focus on. Now I would like to look at the type of questions that are being asked, the nature of the questions that are being asked, right? So we'll take a look at these questions. Assess the role of British imperial power in complicating the process of transfer of power during the 1940s, right? So this phase of freedom struggle of 1940s and the role of British powers in complicating the process of transfer of power. Now this is obviously referring to the movements or the events that were taking place at that point of time, right? Your August offer and how it was negative for us. Your Cripps mission, how it was negative for us. Weighable plans, that thing. Cabinet mission, and how it. So all these movements will be sort of covered in your answer, and because it is asking us what was the role of them in complicating the process of transfer of power, we will be mentioning all the negative aspects of these questions. Now see, we knew that we had to study the various stages of the freedom struggle, so these events were very important. We already knew that from the analysis. But now when we have prepared all the dimensions to these things, like how it was, they can very well ask a question like how in the 1940s there were positive movements taking place towards finally getting freedom. So there you will be talking about the positive aspects of these things, right? So basically what I'm saying is when you have the events in hand, you know that you have to study the events very well. You will analyze that topic in multiple dimensions. You will study that movement's particular introduction. You will be prepared with that. You will know the certain technical specifics of that movement or that event, like who was involved, how it took place, the the development towards that movement and what happened after that, positives of that thing, negatives of that thing, the way forward for that thing. So this is the sort of broad preparation that we follow in general of GS papers, right? So this is something that you will do similar, just that you have to focus on what you want to study very well, right? So that is the first question. Now look at this question. Since the decade of 1920s, the national movement acquired various ideological strands and thereby expanded its social base. Again, you will have to know the developments of that period, right? A few events you will be knowing, like the non-cooperation movement, right? A lot of revolutionary activity took place during that point of time, right? Something related to the Muslim League. Then other ideological strands that can come about, like your socialism, right? So basically, the whole events that took place based on the events that you've studied, like I mentioned, the August offer, etc., etc. These type of events that would have happened in the 1920s are your basic feeder material for mentioning the ideological strands that took place, right? And then you have to sort of think in the exam that how it would have affected the people who are part of those movements, and then you should explain more on expanded social base. And since it's a discuss question, you will obviously add a negative dimension to it also, like how they were not very effective in sort of bringing about a very mass movement that shook the British Empire. But then you also have to write the fact that yes, it sort of created a movement towards in a positive direction for our freedom struggle as well, right? For example, the role of Congress, etc., can be mentioned very well here. The different conferences that took place, right? Bring out the constructive programs of Mahatma Gandhi during NCM and civil disobedience movement. Now, this is a straight up question. You have to prepare events. The various stages of freedom struggle have to be prepared. Obviously, you have studied NCM and civil disobedience movement. Now, since I mentioned you have to be prepared with all the multi-stakeholder actors, tribals, women, Gandhiji's role is being directly asked here. I mean, you will have prepared 5 points for that, 5 points for NCM, 5 points for CDB, Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, then a few positives of both these movements and his role, few negatives of how somehow it was lacking in certain aspects, and then the logical progression to that, like what happened after that in the conclusion part, I think is a good way to end that answer. So modern history, like instead of opening a spectrum and reading it from page number 1, take a micro theme, deep dive into the whatever dimensions that you can think about, right? Prepare 5, 6 points on each dimension that you can think about, different stakeholders of those micro themes, and then practice that in delivering an answer, right? For example, I would like to show you a question that I had written in your modern history, right? So the British, who never gave concrete consent even for granting dominion status to India at the beginning of 1940s, finally left the country in a hurry by granting complete independence even before the anticipated date. This was not the question. This is the question. Analyze, right? So now I should not make this mistake, which often I see a lot of people do, is that they just talk a lot about the context that is given. That is not a question. There should be more analysis here than giving this background of all the events that took place in the 1940s, right? So I have to stick to the 1940s and especially the beginning of the 1940s, and then sort of come to the logical progression with the help of analysis, not just give a content filled answer without an analysis to it, right? So just let's take a look at it. So my introduction is basically in explaining the context, which is the different events that took place during the 1940s, or August Declaration, Cabinet Mission, Mountbatten Plan, and etc. Okay, that is the basic background. Ki, okay, I know a few events that had taken place in the 1940s. If I write an answer to the question or give you an analysis, these are some things that I know of, and you can be assured that I will talk about that pretty well. So they never gave concrete consent. So an analysis to that. Now, how the August offer happened, but what was the part of that did not give us concrete consent? Constituent Assembly not fully Indian. That was the August offer's problem. So that was not a concrete, offer to us. Cripps Mission, Constituent Assembly mainly Indians and Dominion status. Governor General had veto. Again, you're not really giving us anything of value here, right? The Wavell plans, caste Hindus and Muslims with representation and Dominion status. That is really not a very big representation. Cabinet Mission, process of balkanization and accepted the inevitable independence of India. So you're basically going to balkanize our country, which is not what we really want. So you're not again giving us anything concrete. Mountbatten Plan, Boundary Commission, Radcliffe Commission, that was there to divide into 2 separate dominions for complete independence. A lot of our leaders didn't really want to have the country divided into 2 parts. Again, you're not really giving us what we want. Okay. Now then, what is the shift in the British attitude? They had to leave in a hurry, which was also part of the question. So again, analyze that based on the events that I have studied. Post-war scenario, Britain was no longer superpower, could not contain India for much longer. USA, Soviet Union was now superpowers. Okay. So after that, what we can see is that there is a second part of the analysis. Now, because there was a mention in the question that they hurriedly left the country and there was a shift in their policy, now I'm going to analyze a few other parts of the syllabus or the events that I have studied and give an analysis into them as to why they would have done that. So there were a few reasons that I could think of. So there was a post-war scenario that Britain was no longer a superpower. There was pressure from the United States and other Soviet powers, right? So that was one of the reasons. There was a change in the government in the Britain. So liberal government had come into place right after World War II, and they favored independence for India as compared to Churchill earlier. Dent in the loyalty of the army and the navy. For example, a few events I've underlined: INA trials, RIN mutiny, etc., etc. They kind of eroded the British base of power in India, right? On which they had control. And there was pressure from the global powers as well, right? The formation of the United Nations had taken place. Pressure from USA more for liberty and independence, right? And then the freedom movement at our home was also a part in contributing a change in attitude, right? The Quit India movement could not be controlled any longer, and there was a huge scale communal violence as well, right? So the British had problem in controlling that. And then the war-weary British soldiers who had already fought very hard in the World War II did not want to engage militarily anymore. They were tired. And also I missed a point of that economic difficulties that the families of the soldiers and everything else. Plus they were made to go and serve in Indonesia as well. Kind of they lost their trust and the support of their own army, right? So they could not sort of control the Indian freedom movement any longer. So they had a change of heart. There was a change of attitude, right? So due to a great shift in global and national circumstances, Britain had to quit India. Okay. So this is basically the analysis part, right? Focus, a lot of events, a lot of instances. You have to present it in a manner to the examiner where it's a sort of analysis key. Okay, 5-6 points were happened. This is the reason for this, and then you have to kind of proceed with the answer. Also write point wise, write the keyword first, give a dot, give a colon, and then sort of present your argument in a sentence or two, and underline the important events that you have given, right? So this is something that I had written. 15 marks question, I had only 11 minutes to write. Also, you have to think about a lot of events, and this syllabus is quite huge. So this is a kind of answer that I could come up with, right? There can be definitely improvements in this, maybe a flowchart kind of approach to the offers, etc. But then again, also be sure that you use the language in the question itself as your heading, right? Never, for example, if my heading is this, never gave concrete consent, then my heading in the answer will be never gave concrete consent as well, right? So that kind of gives an impression, a psychological impression to the examiner that the question that I have asked is being answered as it is, right? So that is one of the things that you should keep in mind, right? So now, how to make notes on these things are some things that we can look at, right? So for example, if you look at the notes part, we know that we have to study the events well. So you can sort of divide them into your year-wise, because see, the questions have been asked in the PYQs as well in the same manner, right? For example, the questions were being asked based on the years, 1920s, right? Then again, we had a question earlier in the PYQs being asked based on the years, 1940s, 1920s, right? So 19th century. So questions are being asked based on year-wise and event-wise, right? So you can either have year-wise notes or event-wise notes. So for example, if you look at how we want to make notes based on years, then what are the events that took place in that year, key features of that event, so you have some arguments to give, and then the significance of that event. You can also add a column of year, like what are the different stakeholders and what were their roles in those events or in those years, right? So for example, 1919, we have the Government of India Act. So key features of those acts, very nice point-wise, keyword-rich features, which are basically going to be your headings of your points, right? Significance is that given here so that if they ask you to analyze what was the role of those events or what changed during that time, you have some crisp points to give in that context, right? Simon Committee Commission report. Again, what were the salient features of that? What were the different important implications of that, right? Government of India Act 1935, again asked a lot. So these crisp points here and the significance of that. August offer, Quit India movement, right? So prepare it event wise based on years so that you have a better understanding. And then if you can go into a sort of detailed manner for the major events. For example, your August offer. Alternatively, I can think of important events such as non-cooperation movement. I feel like you should have a A4 sheet for that particular important movements in your freedom struggle as well, like your NCM, your civil disobedience movement, Dandi March, Swadeshi movement, right? What else can we think of? Quit India movement, your INA trials, your Navy mutinies. So these are certain very, very important movements. I feel like you should spend a little more time on them as compared to the other movements, right? So maybe you can get a better return on investment on that. So Congress response. So basically, like I mentioned, different stakeholders to that particular event and what was their response, their contribution. So the one stakeholder is Congress, the other is Muslim League, right? Your British administration is one of the other your stakeholder, right? So Cripps mission, proposals, advantages, disadvantages, why it failed, what was the implication of that, right? Significance and evaluation. So Quit India movement, again, see how do you study an important movement. So for example, Quit India movement is something that we have to study much better than the others. So important slogans, this is good validation, right? For example, if they ask you something on Quit India movement and what was the implication, you could write that people were heavily involved in that and they also developed certain slogans, example, and then you write this Bharat Chodo by Yusuf Meher Ali. Like, I would box this name as well, so that this kind of gives a validation component, right? Do or Die by Gandhiji, again validation component, right? Causes may you have an analysis part, because he can ask you what are the causes of the Quit India movement or what led to the Quit India movement. So these few points will be coming in as it is, right? What happened in the Quit India movement, what were the implications? So you can mention these points as well. What was the role of Gandhiji in that, right? Because I feel like we have already seen that type of question. Bring out the constructive programs of Mahatma Gandhi during NCM. It can very well be Quit India movement as well, right? So that can come in again there. So what are the different salient features? Like a feature of parallel governments was seen very specifically in the Quit India movement. Now there can be a holistical question on this part itself, like what was the role of parallel governments in the freedom struggle, and where were they and how did they contribute to the struggle? So that kind of a dimension also you must prepare well. Who participated in that event, what was the impact, what was the chronology, significance, British response, and the key personalities that were associated with this movement, right? So this is a sort of thing I would suggest to prepare for your modern history. It'll get your syllabus done much easier. You will be better equipped to answer the questions in the exam, right? And I would suggest do this for all the themes, all the micro themes, right? Tribals, peasants, constitution, colonial rule and impact, British policies and economic policies as well, right? So all these things should be prepared. Your notes should be prepared in this particular manner itself, based on years or personalities or events and important dimensions that you can make out of it. So if you look at this question, the period of 1940s, I've already written a similar question, but 1940s was characterized by collision of imperial ambitions, nationalist fervor, communal tensions, leaving a lasting imprint on the political landscape of South Asia. Now, basically, it's a discussed question. So what we have to do is, the way to answer this question is, firstly, restrict yourself in the frame of the 1940s. There is a lot of things that happened in the 1900s and whatever, but the question is very specific to the 1940s. So my frame is restricted. Now I have 4 angles that I have to talk about in the answer. One is your imperial ambitions, one is your nationalist movements or fervor, one is the communal tension, and now I have to relate how these are important in this particular period with my political landscape in South Asia. Now the reason I've done this kind of a flowchart in your mind is that when you practice answer writing very well, you can do this kind of mind mapping in your brain when as soon as you read the question. If you're not used to practicing answer writing, what can happen is you can miss out this part and you can take the whole of freedom struggle that you have read and sort of start talking about the collision of these aspects with political stability and landscape in South Asia. Now you can, if you take the 1920s, and you can talk about the communist conference that had happened, right? But that is not relevant here because we are specifically talking about the 1940s. So you can sort of go off track and then we'll wonder why we did not get much marks in the question, because we are not sticking to the demand of the question. So when you practice answer writing well, you will sort of be used to holding 3-4 concepts and constraints in your mind and limiting yourself. So this is very similar to your filter sort that you use in your on the internet in certain pages. So there are constraints given to you. Be in this area only and link the dimensions in these particular areas only, right? So let's look at the content here. So in the introduction itself, they have mentioned content regarding the 1940s only. For example, they're not writing about non-cooperation movement. That also had a very good international impact in South Asia, but Quit India movement, because the question is only on 1940s, we will use the examples also which are relevant to that particular time period. Formation of the Indian National Army, INA, right? Partition of India. Okay, so imperial ambitions was one of the aspects that we had to compare in the 1940s with your South Asian landscape, right? So World War II, imperial ambitions were there. Your heightening British resolve to retain control over the region. Again, British needed control of India for their war machine. So that is another very important part. Cripps mission, again mentioned, relevant year 1942, right? Economic exploitation, Great Famine of Bengal, again 1942, right? Suppression of dissent, suppress anti-colonial activities and maintain other order during war. So these are all related to the imperial ambitions and what their effect was in South Asia, sticking with the examples and the events related to the year or the time period of 1940s only, right? We'll go back to the national second dimension that we have to compare, which is nationalist fervor. Again, Quit India movement in 1940s, that is a good argument with respect to your national movements. Mass mobilization, civil disobedience, which was the call of do to die, right? Youth involvement, a lot of young leaders who were involved in the Quit India movement. You should underline when you give examples so that it brings out, circle your example like this and underline your Usha Mehta, Ram Manohar Lohia, Biju Patnaik, etc., right? Subhash Chandra Bose and his role in the Indian National Army, again 1940s. Underground Radio by Usha Mehta, again during the Quit India movement, and the Mutinian trials, right? And communal tensions, again related to 1940, Lahore Resolution of 1940, Communal Direct Action Day, August 16th, right? Bengal and Punjab, British policies, right? So then finally we're comparing them with the political landscape or the imprint on South Asia in the 1940s itself. So partition of India, migration, a lot of exodus happened from this country as well. The relation between India, Pakistan, and the war on Kashmir that took as soon as we had partition, and the communal legacy, right? To this day, we can sort of feel the cracks in our communal fabric because of the events of the past. So that can also be mentioned alternatively here, right? Any international event at that point of time which you feel is relevant as well can be mentioned. For example, the meetings that Nehruji had with the other colonial powers, other colonized states can also be mentioned. For example, the involvement with Africa. We also had somebody go to China to interact and talk about what aid and assistance we can provide them. So some kind of these innovative points can also be mentioned here. And then you conclude with a brief overview of the entire answer that you've written, that yes, a lot of things happened, different interests were at stake, and this is how somehow it impacted the political landscape in India at that point of time, right? So this is how you would broadly prepare your modern history and deliver content on that, event wise, year wise preparation, and then deliver the content keyword wise with a lot of examples, and stick to the demand of the question. It's very easy to go off track simply because they give a lot of constraints, and we are very excited when we see the question that we have a lot of content to give, but then it is important to limit our answers and our examples to the relevant time frame and the relevant events that are being asked, right? So this is how we'll cover modern history. Now let's come to society. Right, a lot of questions have been asked on society, right? It's a very high number. 76 questions being asked, and preparation of this subject is very, very easy also, because a lot of these concepts are very intuitive. We have gone over them in the past many times across different subjects. Also, if we have been very regular with the newspaper, a lot of these issues get discussed a lot in your editorial pages or op-ed pages, right? So opinion pages will give you a lot of data. We talk a lot about women, depressed classes, transgenders. I mean, most relevant topics are always being talked about in the newspaper. So you already have a very good idea with respect to the most of the things in this subject, right? The only thing that we have to do is enrich ourselves with value addition and practice answer writing so that we are able to deliver content. Also, a few examples or case studies can also add value to your answers. So, right, look at these things. Urbanization. I mean, when you are studying local self-government in your GS2 part itself, urbanization and urban development bodies we study that well. So we at that point of time also study and analyze the problems with urbanization in India. So the different poverty aspects related to poverty or slum in the cities, then the low value of living, standard of living in the cities because of overstressed resources, for example water, communicable diseases, lack of education, role of women. This is very overlapped with your GS2 part as well, right? So when you study that, this is somehow you will get an idea of that. For example, look at globalization. Now this is a micro theme that goes across GS papers. Once you have analyzed that in one paper, I don't think you have to spend too much time to study it differently here. Just that be aware that you will be asked to sort of link 2-3 micro themes and give your answer, right? So that is something that you have to do in the paper as well. But the way you will practice and develop that skill is by doing a lot of answer writing with different test papers, right? So look at the different themes here. Urbanization, ex-government programs, linking themes, tribes, communism, regionalism, families being asked a lot, uniqueness of society, secularism, caste system, poverty, development, diversity, population. Again, GS2 repeated topic, globalization, GS2 again, women, urbanization. So a lot. I mean, it's very unlikely that anybody will not be prepared for society already if you're a UPSC aspirant. But then just do them well, because 76 questions have been asked here, and these are very scoring subjects. So right, a society answer can give you really high marks and give you a reward, right? So again, the way to study is, now we know the micro themes. Now we pick one micro theme and prepare them well. For example, today I decided to do caste system. So then I go to caste system and analyze the PYQs that have been asked, so that I know much more relevantly now what areas in that particular micro theme I should focus on more. I will cover it broadly in my notes. I will study the other dimensions that I think can come as well, because it is obviously can't predict everything, but then some repeated themes that are consistently being asked in that particular micro theme as well will kind of give us a better ROI, right? So look at the type of questions that are being asked. Caste identity in India is both fluid and static. Okay, so basically analyzing the nature of caste in India. Okay, we have to make two dimensions. One heading will be fluid, one will be static, one will be how it has changed over the period of time and how we can sort of overcome it, and then a way forward with some government initiatives, right? Debate issue of whether and how contemporary movements, so again movements, assertion of Dalit identity work towards annihilation of caste. So annihilation of caste is a very important topic. Okay, so basically removal of the system, the evils of the system, right? Has it lost its relevance in understanding the multicultural Indian society? So basically they're linking caste system with multiculturalism. Two aspects are combined together, right? Is caste system assuming new identities and association forms and hence cannot be eradicated in India? Comment, right? Again, look at this repetition. Caste identity, new identities, right? Form is it fluid, static? Again, associational forms, right? Annihilation of caste, has it lost its relevance? So there is a sort of repetition in the nature of the questions that are being asked. From what I can pick out of this micro theme is that I have to study what is the nature of the system. What is the nature of the system? What are the important dimensions? Current status with respect to, is it annihilated? How relevant is it today? Okay, then what are the different movements taking place with respect to this? Because I see movements for association of identity here, movements taking place. Okay, then I would sort of pick out value addition aspects. What are the different civil societies? What are the different developments, laws, judgments that I can use to add value if a question is being asked? Before this, I would also add the historical aspect. If they ask me to compare how it has progressed in today's society and the evolution of caste basically over the period of time, I would also think of a dimension like how does the system draw its source from ancient India, because across GS1 also they can sort of link 2-3 topics. So what was the role of caste system in medieval history, or the role of caste system in, or the events that took place for the annihilation of caste during the freedom struggle. For example, there were a lot of temple entry movements, a lot of reformist activities. So something on that lines can also be coming, right? They can ask you to analyze that. So I will prepare this topic like this very holistically, so that I have equipped myself with relevant arguments and points, as well as validation material in case an answer comes, so that I can add value to that answer and also give a good argument, right? And obviously, after all this, I would study the way forwards for this, right? Like, how do you finally tackle this problem? Because, like I said earlier also, as a civil servant, you're supposed to give solutions, not just analyze problems. There should be certain ideas that you have in mind. For example, certain civil society is doing certain initiatives that can be mentioned, or certain things that you can do. Maybe Dr. Ambedkar's ideas can be mentioned here on how to implement them, right? So a lot of things that you can mention, certain innovative examples or case studies or something that is being done can definitely be mentioned here. So you have a better argument to give, right? So now I've seen the nature of the questions, I know how to prepare it. So then I would go ahead and prepare that particular topic. So I would make my notes in this manner. I would give a brief introduction, like I mentioned, the evolution and the nature, right? This diagram is pretty good as a validation material. For example, if a question is asked on caste, if I start with this in my introduction, I feel like it gives a lot of value and visually just very appealing and very easy to understand, right? So caste basically, like the origins say, that started as a division of labor, right? It has aspects of endogamy, it has aspects of hierarchy. I would sort of make another structure here, maybe a 4-angle diagram. I would memorize based on notions of purity, maybe not changeable, inherited, interdining not allowed, etc., etc. Whatever angles that you can think of, just to give value to your diagram, you can mention this, right? So then we have the ideas of thinkers here. You can mention these ideas. A few quotes here. Caste is not just a division of labor, but it's division of laborers. Again, gives the idea that it is not really a division of labor. It is a division between people based on certain factors of birth, which are not really under control, right? So you can make that point much more relevant and out there. So, like I mentioned, the origin, the nature, you can study this. Yeah. So this is kind of a good note, right? If they ask you what was the nature of caste during the ancient period or the colonial times, so you have a few points ready, right? And how they developed. So this is something that you can prepare for well. So original and multiple themes that can associated with it. Works on that. For example, certain literature can be asked. Like they ask you what are the different newspapers during the modern history movement, the freedom struggle that helped and contribute. So something on the lines of caste reformation can also be used to ask you what are the different literary sources or writings by people that helped understand the nature of caste better, right? So a few examples, if you know them, can be used to name drop so that you add value to your answer. Characteristics of caste system, basically the important features or dimensions of caste that have gone about. Difference between caste and varna, again, caste understanding in Indian society, different aspects, salient features of that particular system, disparities, economic structure, social life, violence, identity, theoretical group, etc. So these are a lot of dimensions that you can cover. So what are the challenges in eradicating it today, which is again and again asked in the microthemes as well, right? They had asked a question, whether do you think the annihilation of caste is possible? So you might give arguments in favor or not in favor, both you must give. So explain the challenges first, and then you can sort of talk about how to eradicate caste, the needs given, changes in the system, and then new identities and associated forms, right? With changing times, they have again asked the question on that, right? Is it fluid or static, right? And has it lost its relevance? Assuming new identities and associational forms. So this is sort of going to help you to analyze these kind of dimensions. What is the new nature of caste in today's time with the changes in technology or the rapid globalization, or a lot of people going to the United States and coming back to study, intermingling across cities, like migration. So things change and things take a new shape and form. So somehow, what are the new things that have taken place? You must be asked to analyze that. You must be able to do that. So reasons for the change, like modern education, urbanization, legal safeguards, civil society, involvement, right? And so these are the different dimensions that you can think of. Yeah, reasons that it still exists, like we can't definitely say that it has been completely removed. So what are the reasons for that is another question that I feel can be asked. And different between the urban and rural caste system. Basically, a lot of dimensions. Now you can make difference between caste system practiced between the economically well-off rich people and the people who are not that well-off. That can be another dimension. Between women, how women are more subjected to caste as a double, kind of disadvantage in society. Firstly, there is a gender problem, and then there's a caste-based problem. So these type of things can be made to analyze, and then finally your way forward on how to eradicate the system. And then again, movements that took place post independence. Also, these are very relevant. In post independence India, these kind of questions can be asked, right? A few cases, a few examples, a few judgments, etc. So that can help you add value to your answer, right? So this is the sort of notes that you'll make. Different dimensions you'll create, and then you'll give content based on those particular dimensions, right? Now look at a question. Caste is the most pervasive social institution in India, shaping identities, opportunities, and relationships. Do you agree, sir, is the correct policy approach for its eradication? Now there are multiple factors to this. Most pervasive social institution, shaping identities, opportunities. So these are the dimensions that we have to cover. Shaping identities, opportunities, and relationships, right? They ask you, do you agree? You must mention that very clearly and suggest the correct policy approach for its eradication. So we have to talk about caste and how it shapes identities, how it provides people with opportunities or does not provide people with opportunities. There will be positives and negatives in both nature of positive and negative arguments in all these dimensions, right? And then relationships also, like relationships such as marriage or interdining, etc. These kind of things. So in introduction on caste system by Max Weber, shaping identities, you will talk about that briefly, right? Then you'll talk about opportunities, and then you talk about relationships. For example, you can see here like marriage, social interactions, community ties, intercaste relationship. Also, you can take a rural approach also, as well as land holding, right? Using water from wells, etc. There has been a lot of cases where discrimination on that front has also taken place. So you can mention that as well, right? Other than that, you will mention the different dimensions that have still taken a more role. Because see, we cannot just argue unilaterally in one dimension ki yes, caste is definitely helping all these things. Sometimes you have to take a negative approach as well, in a negative sense, that there are other factors other than caste that also determine these things. So one of them is religion, then the other is language, gender, economic status, regionalism. Like for example, there can be instances where religion takes a more important role over caste when people are trying to discriminate, or maybe when people are trying to make arrangements, right? So it's not that caste is the only thing. There are multiple other factors at play here as well, like gender, like economic status, like regionalism, etc., right? So you have to give an argument from that end as well. And then finally, you have to give a way forward, which is basically on how you can reform that particular thing based on policy or eradication. So you'll mention a lot of things like economic policies, legal measures, inclusive curriculum, government initiatives, civil society initiatives, and then finally end with a good positive conclusion that yes, these things have to be taken place, and this is how sort of we'll grow as a society, right? So this is how you'll kind of write your answer based on the question and demand. Now I've written an answer here. Which among the following impediments before realizing the annihilation of caste in India, traditional practices or vested political interests, right? Okay, so we have to talk about which is the major impediment in removing caste. Is it traditional practices, which is our cultural thing, and or political vote bank or political interests, right? So I start with my introduction based on Dr. Ambedkar, that like we have already seen, it's not division of labor but division of laborers, right? A nice quote. I should probably do this to that, right? Then I mentioned the article here, article 17. Okay. Then I go to the traditional. I give an argument that yes, it is because of traditional practices. I mentioned a few points, right? Marginalization of lower caste economically. Villages and panchayats have hierarchy based on caste. Pani panchayats and panchayat patis are also avenues for casteism. Teaching at home and social practices ingrained impressionable children, so children are very impressionable to these kind of things. Then I give an argument from the vested political interest side, right? Vote bank politics. A lot of political parties have come up just based on caste. So that kind of propagates that idea in itself, right? So a few examples there. Political offices based on caste have always been traditionally held by people in the villages. Then regionalism and communalism for vested interests, reservation in jobs for education. Now that's a caste-based argument, but at the end of the day, reservation and things are kind of political in nature as well, right? So that is how you put that argument there. Now, always end with how to deal with that problem. So there are a few way forwards. I've given Tamil Nadu models there, Article 320, 332, affirmative action, right? Education awareness, etc. And then you finally end with a good quote that Rabindranath Tagore had also lamented the biggest obstacle to progress in India was caste system. So that you show that, okay, it is a problem and that we have to sort of work on it and remove it. So this is I think a 10 marker, right? And you have 7 minutes to write this answer. So if you have dimensions prepared well in advance, then you will not waste time in thinking of what you want to write. It will just be content delivery, right? So from society, let's go to geography, right? I think the highest amount of questions asked across any subject is in geography. A total of 91 questions have been asked, right? So we have different themes that we can divide our geography syllabus into, right? So once you have these kind of things in mind, it is very easy to prepare this paper. You kind of can break down the syllabus. So let's look at the number one themes that have been asked in geography. So the highest being water management with your different aspects such as river linking, right? Glaciers, your geomorphology, conceptual clarity should be had in this particular thing, like tectonic plate movement, continental drift, forces affecting the earth, climatology, again very important, right? Primary sector, secondary sector, climate change, again very important these days. Your energy, oceanography, different events, geographical phenomenon like cyclones, tornadoes, etc. So I think if you are very well prepared with your NCRT or your physical geography, if your physical geography is good, then I feel almost 60 to 70% of the questions will be very easy to answer because they'll be kind of static in nature, right? Other than that, they always ask a new phenomenon. For example, twister was asked in my paper. So now I feel like this is something that you have to do on spot. You'll not be obviously prepared for everything that can be asked, but just the name, like does it sound like something that rotates? It was mentioned it was in the ocean, in the Gulf of Mexico, etc. So I kind of made an analysis about what it could be, and then you have to give arguments to sort of write that answer. So I feel like geography, because it's such a big subject, you will have to prepare all these things, all these content, static material as well, your NCRTs. But because you have studied for this in the prelims paper very well, you are very well thoroughly equipped to answer this question. You know a lot of points and you must have prepared a lot of diagrams. So it must not be that big an issue. What we must focus on geography is how to write an answer. And that is what I will be talking about. So like take this example of that question of twister. Let's talk about something that we don't really know. Now, if you are asked something about twister, if you have certain fixed points on how to answer any question if asked on a geographical phenomenon, let's say point A, B, C, D you have ready with, then you can just sort of use these points to answer this question. Now this can be a hit or miss, but at least we'll ensure that we do not leave the answer empty. Because see, a lot of overlap happens on the geographical phenomenons, right? So for example, if we are talking about cyclones and we're talking about your heat waves, the point about ocean temperature, surface temperature, moisture, humidity, wind flow pattern is going to be relevant across all these phenomena. It doesn't work in that way where a few things only impact cyclones and a completely exclusive set of things impact heat waves. There is going to be some overlap of physical geographical phenomenon across both these things. So by writing ocean currents affect cyclones, but ocean currents affect heat waves also, we are not going to be wrong here. It just depends on what extent these phenomenon sort of contribute into these cyclones or heat waves. So by mentioning the point of ocean currents, you're not going to go wrong. So if we prepare these few geographical phenomenon well and we know what to write exactly in points, we can try to attempt this question if a new phenomenon is asked, right? Other than that, all these other issues like urban geography will be very repetitive across your environment factor, right? Tertiary sector, your primary sector, energy is going to be repetitive in your GS3 part of infrastructure and energy, right? So you'll have these things prepared very well. So let's just take an important theme, which is climatology, right? So once I decide to study this theme, I'll sort of look at the previous year questions that are being asked. So in climatology, we have studied this very well in the prelims also. Look at this question. Monsoon feeding more than 50% of the world population residing in Asia. Now for this, you have to know the geographical mechanism behind monsoon very well. You will study your GC Leong, will study your PMF. It's given very well in that. There are 5 to 6 points that affect the monsoon, your tropical jet stream, your low pressure troughs, your wind flow patterns, right? The movement of the southwest, your topography, which will stop the winds and drop rainfall. So 5 to 6 points you already know have to be written in this point. So if you have these things prepared already, you can answer that question very easily, right? For example, look at the second question. What do you understand by the phenomenon of temperature inversion in meteorology? How does it affect the weather and habitants of a place? Again, you have to be prepared for this question. You can't just make up things here, but temperature inversion is very well given in your NCERT. So if you're prepared with your static, you'll be able to answer that. Again, hot deserts, why they are where they are. Again, geographical mechanism behind that. Troposphere is very significant atmospheric layer that determines weather processes, how. So the mechanism behind how weather systems take place and how it affects climate and how a particular region of the atmosphere is important there. So I think a lot of questions that are being asked, for example, directly as asked as El Nino, right? Question on El Nino, concept of air mass. So these are the certain things that you have to be prepared with, right? So static, geographical phenomenon, their mechanism, recent changes due to climate change, how to mitigate, and certain developments that have taken place on them, right? You have to prepare these for your static concept in geography. But I think if you have prepared well for the prelims, then this should not be an issue. You already will know most of the things that you have to prepare. For example, your landforms, erosional, depositional landforms, how they are formed, their diagram, what are the changes that are taking place in them these days, right? Your rapid earth movements like landslides, etc., which will be common across your disaster management as well. So if you're prepared for the prelims exam, you will know most of the things very well if you have studied physical geography pretty well, right? This is one of the questions that I think was kind of a new one. Purvaiya based on the Bhojpur region, and how is this for directional seasonal wind system influenced by cultural ethos of a system? Now this is something that you have to write on the spot. You will not have been prepared for this question. Even I didn't know very well, but I drew the diagram of the West Bengal branch of the southwest monsoon, which is, I don't think, very correct. It's incorrect answer. It was a very regional phenomenon, but then sometimes it is a hit or a miss, right? So we have to be prepared the best we can. There will always be something that we have not studied, right? But still try to attempt that question. Like I mentioned, have 5 to 6 points based on geographical phenomenon always ready, so that when a question comes, these are neutral points to be put in any kind of geographical phenomenon, right? So you can mention it there as well, right? So let's take a look at the way that geographical answers can be written, right? Because I feel it's more about answer writing here. So when you have a question on climatology, for example, our introduction should be definition based and classification based. Like if they're asking us based on something, a phenomenon based on climate, like the troposphere and how it is impacting monsoon or weather events, then I must mention what the troposphere is. I must mention the classification that I use to draw that distinction, and the patterns and processes of the Earth's climate that impact long-term atmospheric conditions, right? In the main body, I should have a diagram, a flow chart, right? A diagrammatic representation of the explanation and the factors influencing, right? So now these factors are something that you can always be prepared with, right? For any geographical phenomenon, latitude and longitude will always affect that thing. For example, your ocean currents, your cyclones. You know that cyclones are tropical up to a certain latitude, and after that, it becomes your temperate cyclones. So why tropical cyclones are formed only between certain regions is because of the factor of this latitude, because of the sun's radiation, because of the altitude, maybe atmospheric circulation, ocean currents, topography, vegetation. Now, if you have these 7 to 8 dimensions in mind, in any question that they ask you about why cyclone take place here only, or why does monsoon get impacted, you can always think on these arguments as your keyword point. Write one latitude and give a point on that. Analyze how that would be relevant to that particular thing, right? If they are asking sun radiation and they're talking about heat waves, or they're talking about corals, for example, corals, Then latitude is one dimension that I already know. Okay, now latitude. Now why corals are impacted by latitude? Okay, because at higher latitudes there is cold water. They need a certain temperature of water. So latitude is one dimension that is going to impact corals. Then they can ask sun radiation. Okay, they need sunlight so that they can produce food. So sun radiation is another aspect that will determine the formation of corals. Then altitude, maybe atmospheric circulation is another important part, right? They can't have very turbid water. They cannot have very cloud cover should not be much. Otherwise, because of circulation, if there is rainfall, heavy rainfall, then there can be some kind of turbidity and can affect coral formation. Ocean currents again will impact coral. Topography, vegetation, volcanic activity. So basically not all of these points are relevant for corals, which is an example, but if you have a set criteria of geographical aspects in mind, you can just think about what answer you are giving and how it is relevant, and pick and choose these dimensions so that you can mention your points very quickly without wasting time in the exam or brainstorming it there as to what is the relevant arguments that I can give in that particular part, right? Impact on human activities, right? Disasters, human health, biodiversity. So these are different dimensions that you can make. Impact on climate and weather, pressure belts, jet streams, ocean currents. Again, these keywords are very important for geography answers. You can just use them directly. Pressure belts, jet streams, ocean currents, rainfall, wind. So particular topic like climate, mechanism, different factors affecting factors, changes due to climate change, what are the different roles of other geographical phenomenon in affecting them, and then finally something about like your mitigation or disaster that you can talk about. So you can prepare this whole topic in this manner, right? Impact of climate change, again, like I mentioned there, you can pick up from here as well. So a lot of factors are helping to impacting climate change in that manner, like your sea level rise, melting ice caps, and finally a conclusion that you can give in any kind of climate based answer or any question on climatology, right? So that is somehow something that you can prepare for. For example, look at this question. Discuss the significance of thermohaline circulation regulating Earth's climate, potential impact of its disruption, right? So first you have to give a significance in regulating the climate, and then we have to give the impact if it's disrupted, right? So first we define the THC, right? Ocean conveyor belt. You can give an example of AMOC also, that you can give a like they have drawn the diagram here. If you can draw the diagram of AMOC, it's well and good. It explains that you know the concept, the movement of the denser water from below the ocean surface, from the polar regions to the equatorial region, where that water again gets evaporated, becomes more saline, and based on salinity, the more saline water goes underneath, and there is a kind of a conveyor belt that is flowing across the poles, from water from the poles to the equator, which kind of regulates the movement, right? It has also wide-reaching implications on ecosystem. So give a definition first, then because the question is the significance, you mention the few points: heat redistribution, right? Carbon cycle regulation, nutrient cycling, monsoon influence, climate stability, etc. So 5-6 dimensions that were well prepared in advance are given. Then what are the impact of the thermohaline disruption? Regional cooling in Europe, intensification of tropical storms, collapse of fisheries, altered monsoon patterns, something about cyclones, how they're affecting them, sea level rise as well, like submergence of island states, etc. So, and then a conclusion to that answer, right? So I would again try to add a dimension on how we can sort of help in mitigating that by using eco-friendly technologies if you want to create another dimension. But other than that, having crisp points ready will help you to deliver that content better. So geography is basically such a huge topic, but if you divide it into micro themes, think about geographical phenomenon, the mechanisms, especially mechanisms behind that, and changes with respect to climate change aspects and the impact on ecosystems or the impact on human life, on other aspects of mitigation, adaptation. You will be sort of very well prepared to answer any kind of question in geography. But yeah, so that is how you prepare geography. Now let's look at the last part of the GS1 syllabus, which is your art and culture. So art and culture, 30 questions have been asked, right? And most of these questions are based on your kingdoms and their highlights, right? Uh, Art forms, again, very important. I remember questions based on the Gandhara art being asked multiple times, right? They can also ask you compare Gandhara art with Amravati school, your Mathura school, right? They can ask these kind of questions. Then temple architecture between north and south, how they are different, right? Different dance forms, and what are the 8 classical dance forms in India? Compare them. What are the salient features about them? Maybe then sculpture. So prepare these main art forms very well, their features, and compare them with different schools of art as well. So that if the question comes by comparing Gandhara with Greco-Roman, both can be compared. This is a PYQ, so they ask you to compare art forms, which is very asked quite a lot, right? Then other aspects such as sources of Indian history, for example, travelers, their books they had written, what were the implications of that, how they viewed Indian society, especially again and again repeated many times. Philosophical aspects such as Buddhism, right? They'll ask you what is the schools of Buddhism that developed, right? Certain aspects on philosophy can also be asked here, as to what is the philosophy that Buddha had and how it helped shape the socio-cultural aspects during that time, right? So they will always ask you what is the impact of certain thing on society. Like they'll ask you what was the social milieu at that point of time and how different things such as Bhakti and Sufi movements helped, oppose the caste system. How they helped women in that point of time, right? So they will ask something about art, culture, or a particular event at that point of time and how it impacted the society at large, right? Uh, Other than that, there are certain miscellaneous topics as well. Like you can't be always prepared for this kind of subject. But then Indus Valley civilization, very important. Like your Harappa architecture, street architecture, and what we can learn in today's time in urbanization, right? Your sculpture, bronze sculptures, how they are, how were they made, what was the process behind them, and what can we learn from them, right? So a lot of things, different dimensions can be opened here. Basically, try to think of art and culture in that manner where you know about a certain art form, but then a certain art form or certain movement such as Bhakti-Sufi, and what is the present contribution of those things, like what how did it impact society at that point of time. This is a thing that I find very recurring, right? They also had asked a question that the technological progress made during the Mughal era, what was those changes and what is its relevance even today, right? So we have to find not just pure artistic things. Like they won't ask you, maybe they won't ask you what is Bharatnatyam and what are the different dance steps, but they can ask you that Bharatnatyam as an art form developed in the temples, and how did it impact society at large. So these are the type of things, or how did it express the nature of philosophy behind certain religion, etc. So they can ask you these type of questions, right? So we must be prepared for them in that sense. So yeah, so let's take a micro theme here. I've taken your Bhakti and Sufi movement. Now look at this. The Bhakti movement received a remarkable reorientation with the advent of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, right? So what was the different things that he had contributed? The monasteries that he had for your art form development, right? Dance forms that he propagated, certain musical forms. Even I am not very aware of, like I don't remember now. I think Satriyas or something, those monasteries were called. I'm not in touch with that subject right now, but yes, certain aspects of that and how it developed in that time. Like he opposed, discrimination. How he used your bhakti and your praise to the divine Lord to help sort of uplift people. So these are the few things that you can talk about. If you have prepared this point, if you know the PYQ, you will have prepared this point. You will have multiple dimensions to talk about this, right? So look at the other question. Sufi and medieval mystic saints failed to modify either the religious ideas and practices of the outward structure of Hindu-Muslim societies to any appreciable extent. This is a straight away question into the failures or the negative aspects of Bhakti movement, Bhakti and Sufi movements. Right? When you prepare Bhakti movement, you will obviously prepare the positives, like it helped oppose the caste system, included women in its fold. It had open interpretation of scripture, so it had a lot of space to sort of absorb different sects and religions into it, so that it had a very holistic approach towards society. But then it did not all work in our favor, right? It did not totally work because we still have problems of caste, etc. even today. So this is a question that you have to understand, that it failed to modify the religious ideas totally and the practices of the outward structure to appreciable extent. But then don't just write this, because we are not saying that Bhakti movement was a total failure. You must add a point here and a dimension in this question that no, they also had a very positive contribution, and yes, there were appreciable changes at that point of time as well. But then you can mention that okay, it was good, but did not work totally as you are saying. So we'll give 5 to 6 points as to the failure of the movement, and then we can sort of conclude with a positive note that yes, all movements are limited in their scope and scale, but then the role of Bhakti and Sufi movements cannot be downsized, downplayed, and they had appreciable changes made even during that time, which are even seen to this day, right? Nature of Bhakti literature, like again, different art forms, like I mentioned, dance, temple, sculpture, literature, just link with the different events that took place at that point of time. So Bhakti literature and its contribution to Indian culture, direct question is there, very easy. Alternatively, think of different dimensions, like Bhakti literature is being asked and its contribution to culture. They can ask you literature during the Mughal times. They can ask you literature written by travelers to India, Al-Biruni. Then you can have Ain Akbari. What was his contribution, right, to historians to analyze the nature of Indian society, right? So these kind of sculptures, carvings, mural paintings, and how they impact your perception of those social periods or those times and the culture that had developed during that time. So pick multiple dimensions and keep relating them to your static subject, which is your Bhakti literature. So if Bhakti literature can help in contribution of Indian culture, tomorrow it can also contribute to the musical forms or the kirtans or the different types of hymns that developed during that time by different people, right? How did it change that? For example, there are kirtans here in musical sense, then bhajans. So every different Sufi saint or Bhakti saint developed their own sort of musical ideas, right? So they can ask you based on that. Then Bhakti literature, if it is changing the culture, then how it opposed the caste systems, give instances or examples, or the thinkers that were there at that point of time who kind of took part in that movement, right? So you have to multiple dimensions you have to study, and you have to prepare it this manner. So if you have to study, let's say, Bhakti literature or Bhakti movement, then let us look at this question. So Bhakti of North India was influenced by Persian literary and political culture in one hand and by popular Sufism on the other hand. Comment. So now again, they have taken a topic and they have related it with a different dimension, which is your travelers, right? And your political culture and Sufism. So Bhakti and Sufi have been compared, right? So you'll give the basic introduction of Bhakti movement, a quote here by Al-Bashan, A.L. that the Bhakti movement was a powerful expression of the emotional and devotional outpouring that reshaped Indian religion and society, brought about a personal devotion and direct connection with the divine, cutting across caste and communal lines. Okay, I did not know that, but that's a good quote to start with. Basically, then you have to break the dimensions, because firstly, it's asking you to compare Bhakti of North India specifically, right? Don't make the mistake of taking South Indian Bhakti saints like Ramanuja or anything, otherwise you will be going off the demand of the question. So be very careful when you read the question. Bhakti of North India influenced by Persian literary and political culture, and then Sufism on other hand. So you have to compare Bhakti of Bhakti of North India with Sufism and Persian literary political culture. So once you have these dimensions ready, you can write on them. For example, first we compare with Persian literature, language, vocabulary, dohas, murid, poetic forms, syncretic themes, Amir Khusrao's work such as Tufat as-Singer, and then you can write about different musical forms that Amir Khusrao developed, which were taken from the Persian cultures, right? Tulsidas ji's Ramcharitmanas, it was written, symbolism, metaphors like Surdas, right? Influence of political culture, right? So political alliances, court patronages was very important thing that helped develop Bhakti, culture at that time. Exchanges, etc. So you have a lot of points that you can write. Influence of popular Sufism. This is the second dimension that we are comparing. So mysticism, devotion, right? Nirgun traditions had much more porous boundaries when it came to Sufism and Islam, right? So that is one thing that you can write. Themes of love and unity, social equality, etc. And then just to open another dimension, you can have other influences where you can sort of mention your South Indian people, South Indian Bhakti traditions, right? They have done here, right? So Basava's devotion to Shiva, etc., which can be compared to just to open more dimensions to give a holistic coverage of the answer. But primarily focus on the demand of the question, which is your North Indian Bhakti movements, right? And just compare them with your Persian influences and your Sufi movements, right? This is how you'll sort of write an answer on Bhakti, right? So if you want to prepare this topic, the way in which our notes should be made is, right, firstly, we'll have a good introduction, a few quotes on Bhakti movement. If any question comes or if you have to give an introduction or conclusion, we will just deliver content directly. We'll be prepared with the conclusion and introduction, right? After this, just we have to compare and open multiple dimensions by comparing the movement in all its aspects, right? First, we will have the key features, the influence of different things. For example, a question was asked in comparing and the influence of Persian and Sufism. Here we have different aspects as well. For example, the Alwar and Nayanar traditions, Islamic influences, Sultanate influences, right? Features of the movement, which is going to be asked as a very direct question, like what are the different features of the Bhakti movement and how it helped shape the social values and culture at that point of time. Direct answers we can give. The features are this: personal God, equality, regional language, orthodox authority rejection, nomadic lifestyle. So these are keywords. You can start your answer with that itself, right? After we have prepared this, and concepts of God and devotion and salvation, basically comparing the philosophical aspects with the Bhakti aspects, so that we are linking two themes of art and culture, which is your philosophy and Bhakti movement, right? So how philosophical aspects are comprised across different Bhakti traditions, for example, Nirgun, Sagun concepts, right? Followed by Tulsidas, Surdas, etc. And Sant Kabir's ideas of Dohas, Guru Nanak Ji's idea of Nirgun, right? So different aspects of salvation or moksha that Bhakti philosophy talks about, right? Because a lot of aspects of Bhakti philosophy, especially with the Hinduism part, is regarding your devotion to God, especially Krishna and Vishnu, by your other saints, for example, Ramanuja, right? Or Madhavacharya. So that is another aspect that they can ask you to compare and how it relates to salvation or moksha with the help of Bhakti traditions, right? Then spread of the Bhakti movement in various parts of India. Now this is like the last question was talking specifically about North Indian Bhakti movement. So you have to prepare based on the different geographical regions as well. Like what was there in South India, what was there in Maharashtra, what were the aspects in Karnataka, Basava, Gujarat, Rajasthan, East India, North India, etc. So you'll prepare that basically geographical distribution of the different Bhakti traditions, sects and movements across the country, right? Important teachings from personalities. For example, a question was directly asked based on Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the previous year questions. So that gives us an idea that we have to be prepared with a few saints or a few notable people from the Bhakti movement. So something like Kabir Das Ji, Guru Nanak, Sant Tukaram, Mirabai, Tyagraj. So the major personalities, we can try our best to prepare them. Obviously, we will not be able to cover everything, but we can be prepared at least to answer certain major or main personalities and their contribution in the movement if asked, right? So our notes should have that as well. And then the most important part is the impact of the Bhakti movement based on the society or the culture or the political scenario at that point of time, which I feel is going to be asked, going to be very relevant. So we have some crisp 9 points ready to answer when we have that in our hand, right? For example, societal reformity and unity, religious transformation, growth of literature, especially your vernacular languages, right? Integration and comparison with Sufism, and your temple culture, temple entry movements, right? And that. And then again for Sufi, we'll have been doing the same thing, and the principles and the major orders based on geographical location as well. And then sort of, talk about the different comparisons and the prominent personalities like we did for Bhakti. Same we have to do for Sufi as well. The social religious contributions and how it shaped sort of Islam in a way, and what are the different art forms that came out of it. For example, Amir Khusrau was very well associated with this Sufi movement. So what was the different type of musical traditions that came out of it, and how it affected the political order at that point of time, because we know that the Mughal emperor was very interested in promoting these social these Sufi institutions, because it also had a very strong political control in those areas at that point of time. So how it was important in the political sense as well, you should prepare that also, right? So yeah, so basically we will prepare the Bhakti and Sufi movement in this manner, multiple dimensions across, cutting across all different art forms, different philosophy, different political scenarios, social, cultural impact, notable personalities, and the art forms that developed out of that particular tradition, right? So this is a broad coverage of the GS1 paper, and I hope you got something of value. Basically, our idea will be to figure out that subject, find the micro themes, focus on a particular micro theme by looking at the previous year questions so that we know which area is more important. Then we will have notes in which we'll cover all dimensions of that particular micro theme by comparing it with different other aspects as well, by analyzing with positive, negatives, way forwards, and different case studies and value addition materials. And then finally, we'll practice on delivering answer through answer writing practices. So this is what we will do for GS1. Thank you.